CityCast from Explocity.
Well, I'm going to read two stanzas from a book I wrote in the womb of the Russian winter in Moscow. A book called Yudhishthir and Draupadi. These are 14-line rhymed sonnets. It's a very long poem, which Gulzar Saab fell in love with and translated the entire book into Hindustani. And here goes then. The sky was pale, its colors drained to accept the venality of the night. The sun, its molten core restrained, festered low, dimmed from sight. As darkness settled on the scene, nothing stirred in the shadowed light. The forest, unmoving, was lush and green, unusually resistant to the sun's might. In the center, an ebon dark pool, hiding its secrets like a woman shamed, still, without a ripple, beyond logic or rule, invisible to the eye, from the senses estranged, not yet dark, nor yet again was it bright, and now began a tale of rare insight. At the pool's rim, 4 bodies lay: Bhim, Arjun, Nakul, Sahdev. They sprawled in death, inert and grey, no longer mighty, strong or brave, blinded to everything but their towering thirst. All caution and craft they had set aside, they dared the pool's guardian to do its worst. Struck down without mercy, they had succumbed and died. O great narrator, whom multitudes revere, obtaining a desire is much like catching a fish. No sooner caught than we begin to hear the imminent death rattle of its eclipse. So the stage is set. 4 bodies, the pool, and 2 jittery survivors in the evening cool.
My guest today is Pavan Varma. He is the National Vice President of the All India Trinamool Congress party, a former Member of Parliament, a former Press Secretary to the President of India, and as a career diplomat, a former ambassador to Bhutan and the Indian High Commissioner, Cyprus. But above all, in my book, an author of substance, a historian, he has authored over a dozen books that are treatises in literature, philosophy, socio-political thought, and commentary. An early book of his was The Great Indian Middle Class, a book that influenced my thinking substantially. 2 of his recent books are candidates for any thinking person's bookshelf. One about the great Indian sage Adi Shankaracharya, and the other titled The Great Hindu Civilization, Achievement, Neglect, Bias, and the Way Forward. The reason I say thinking person's bookshelf is because these books are without polemic. They enable anyone interested in exploring their Hindu identity to do so without submitting to gonzo politics and mindless jingoism. His recent novel, titled When Loss is Gain, is a deeply introspective tale of a man coming to grips with a surprising turn in his life. Writing fiction liberates the writer, and it provides a window into the writer's soul. The prose of fiction tends to yank off any protective veil, and it lets a reader look at a writer's more romantic comportment. I was delighted to be told that my next guest on this podcast was going to be Pavan Varma. So, with that, Pavan K. Varma, it is both my privilege and a pleasure to welcome you to the Literary City.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine.
It is a tough call to limit myself to discussing literature with you when you are such a force of political thought and opinion. But this podcast is about you as a writer and a thinker. So, I figure the best place to start would be your novel, When Losses Gain. The pages following the diagnosis are wonderfully descriptive of how your protagonist feels when confronted with news of immediate mortality. How did you capture such introspection? Did you close your eyes and let your imagination flow?
No, actually, the story was brewing in my head. And while it reads at a fast pace,
It does.
love story also, it's a rumination on life as well.
Mhm.
But essential point was about the gift of life.
Right.
The fact is that we treat it with scant respect, even take it for granted when we have it. But when we lose it, suddenly we are confronted with our own inability to value the priceless, the small things of life, the little joys, which we all ignore somehow on the treadmill towards success and ambition and targets and goals. Uh, but when it's gone, you look back at the barren land that was your life when you had it served to you on a platter, and you didn't do so much that you should have to give it the value it deserves. There's a small couplet in Urdu, दुनिया जिसे कहते हैं जादू का खिलौना है, मिल जाए तो माटी है, खो जाए तो सोना है.
Could you translate that for our listeners who might not follow?
This world, दुनिया जिसे कहते हैं, it's like a magical toy. If you have it, it seems as worthless as the mud. But when you lose it, it's rare and priceless gold. And that is what my protagonist faces in a life spent in somehow trying to get ahead. The daily grind, the morning begins and the night descends, and one day falling over the other. And then he's suddenly confronted with a full stop from which there appears to be no court of appeal. And then the introspection arises.
And a few pages later, more introspection after Paradise Regained, correct?
Yes, indeed.
Life pulls a reverse 180 on him.
Indeed, because suddenly what he thought was irrevocably taken away from him, against all expectation, was returned to. And that is where a new introspection dawns.
Your writing and the descriptions, they are vivid, very picturesque. You know, as someone ought to have said, while journalists go to the field, historians go to the library. But you seem to have done quite a bit of hands on research.
I did. There I was being carried by my own narrative, but certain facts had to be arrived. So I actually checked into a hospital,
Checked into a hospital.
watched the procedures to learn. I was on the Taj Manson roof looking out. I went to Humayun's tomb, and I went to, uh, you know, Nizamuddin Dargah. These are the kinds of research, even in Bhutan, in the book where the protagonist goes and finds a house. I had actually a house which I saw and which I then describe on the banks of the river, midway between Thimphu and Paro. This is the kind of research an author does.
Speaking of places you've been, you started your foreign service career in Bulgaria.
Yes,
And then I understand you went to Ceausescu's Romania. Were you there during the big earthquake?
I wasn't. I wasn't. I was there from 1980 to 82. And for a while, when the ambassadors were changing, I became the officiating in charge of the mission, charge d'affaires. which I was for 4 months. So at a very young age, it's a beautiful country again. And now, of course, far more discovered by tourists from across the world.
Dracula's castle not being the least.
I went to Dracula's castle.
Transylvania.
I went.
I haven't been. I'd love to go. My partner, Radha, she sang in a jazz festival there.
Is that right?
But back then, a different Romania, I guess. What was Ceausescu like?
Ceausescu was the ultimate communist dictator, and Romania was a country almost akin to North Korea, where there was one leader and a personality cult around him, and the rest of the country were cheerleaders.
Now, in these countries, indeed, the whole Soviet bloc, there was such rich literature post war,
Indeed,
but
indeed.
very repressed and censored. Now, they called it social realism, didn't they?
Yes.
Would you say that we are going through a similar social realism in India right now ourselves? You know, plus size leader and with a whole coterie of cheerleaders who will meet any opinion that is not their own with aggression, and that is synonymous with defensiveness. But why is that social realism?
You see, because when a state and many of its agencies are largely illiterate,
Mhm.
when a state assumes that it has the authority to dictate creative choices and defines what is politically correct or acceptable. You can call it social realism in the age of communism in Soviet Union and East Europe. But it's a mirror image of the kind of conformity, intellectual inertness, and creative restraint. In those senses, the two are parallel. And when you have a scenario where one of the great casualties is civilized discourse, what in our tradition we call Shastra,
Right.
where you participate in a dialogue, when you talk with each other and not at each other, when you are receptive to the other point of view. Again, in accordance with our tradition. Our whole tradition is based on dialogue. The three foundational texts of, for instance, Hinduism, the Upanishads are a dialogue. They're not a fiat. The Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue. The Brahma Sutra always includes in its commentaries the viewpoint of the opponent, as they call it, which is a different viewpoint, in order to arrive at a synthesis.
Do you have an example from history?
We have had the famous dialogue between Adi Shankaracharya and Mandan Mishra, where the two sides were implacably opposed in their belief and conviction. Adi Shankaracharya believed in the Jnana Marg, the path of knowledge. Mandan Mishra in the Karma Kand, the path of karma only. But the two met, they talked, they discussed for weeks. And in the absence of social media and television, the entire Hindu cosmos in India followed that debate. And it was a turning point in the evolution of Hindu. What I'm saying is, we are a dialogic system. And when the scope for such dialogue recedes, we are doing great harm to some of the civilizational and foundational tenets of our culture.
We have seen historically several times that dogma, whether it's state sponsored or peer fueled, leads to censorship, and censorship is often defended as necessary as a bulwark against anarchy. Do you think that censorship is ever defensible?
Very often, democratic states become increasingly authoritarian in the name of democracy
Yes, often.
because the state does not need to proactively do anything which appears to be undemocratic. but it can co-opt institutions. It can convey informal signal messages about what is acceptable and what is not. It can encourage other things, including a film, as we saw most recently,
Yes, of course.
where it ensures maximum outreach of a point of view that it endorses. So, exclusion through censorship is very often done today by processes which are not formalized but which are tangible and verifiable.
And what about Fifth Estate censorship? Do you think that Twitter was justified in banning Donald Trump?
I don't personally, Ramji, believe on bans. I believe in rebuttal. I believe in opportunity being granted except in the exceptional case where the weightage of facts and reasonable assessment is that a ban is required. But that is the absolute and probably remote exception.
Right, ideally. But what of the old adage of someone shouting fire in a crowded theater? Surely it cannot be that the only answer is rebuttal, someone else shouting, oh no, there's no fire?
Well, as I said, there is an exception which is immediately hazardous for law and order, security. It's directly inciting violence, hatred, bigotry. I can understand that in sensitive societies where there are concerns and there is volatility. But normally, I would not be a party to a ban on Salman Rushdie's book.
I submit.
I would not ban a film.
Right.
And I would be very hesitant to resort by reflex to such measures unless absolutely warranted.
Right. But someone eventually makes that call and they could get it wrong, couldn't they?
Of course, they could, and mostly they do for totally extraneous reasons.
Right.
Uh, so that is, and very often when you leave it to the judgment of people who operate in simplistic binaries, black or white, then the entire creative process, which is highly nuanced, which should be dialogue, which should provoke fresh thinking, becomes a victim.
Yes, and thus it dies. And now to my favorite book of yours, The Great Indian Middle Class. When I read it in the late 90s, I got the impression that you were saying that the Indian masses were sold a pup in the name of independence. But for many, it wound up being one group of rulers replacing the others, and the mass still left out of the equation. Has your writing, both literary and substantive, changed since then, and how?
No, not essentially, because I believe that the first step in the ending of colonial rule is political freedom. The Union Jack goes down, the tricolor comes up. But colonization itself is a hugely penetrative and complex process. The success of colonization does not lie in physical subjugation, but in the colonization of the mind. And colonizers usually are spectacularly successful in creating an elite in their own image, which, in the name of freedom, actually inherits the power after the colonizer departs. Then there is a cultural legacy. They take your language. They privilege their language even after they have gone in the estimation of the very elite they have created. So speaking English with a certain fluency and accent opens the gates of privilege. Whereas if you do not belong to that cocooned elite, there is a palpable sense of exclusion. So, in other words, colonization, for it to genuinely unravel, takes decades. The process is not yet completed in India. So, and therefore, the great Indian middle class spoke about a middle class in the shadow of 1947 and its evolution, its priorities. What were the initial influences on it of the freedom movement? How it evolved. And then I wrote another important book, Ramji. Perhaps it's one of my favorites. It's called Becoming India, the unfinished revolution of culture and identity, where I analyze this process of post colonial society in far greater detail.
In your follow up book, The New Indian Middle Class, you speak of a certain homogeneity of the middle class culturally and also in terms of how they express outrage.
When concerns and aspirations are similar, cutting across regional divides, then responses tend to be similar because there is a class interest involved.
So, in a post 2014 scenario, do you believe this homogeneity was dented, fractured?
Well, I don't. Fracture is not something that developing societies or developed societies can avoid.
Mhm.
But what is in process today in India now is the gradual devaluation of an earlier elite that prospered on the basis of entitlement by another emerging elite, which, for all its faults, is probably more rooted in the soil and culture and ethos of the country.
You wrote that the middle class had benefited from perpetuating the British systems and had created a new elite. Now you say that the new elite are more rooted, even if more rooted, in the soil, culture, and ethos of the land. By ethos of the land, I'm hearing voting on caste lines. Isn't this creating a new elite? Isn't this just new wine in an old bottle?
You see, caste should be done away with, and yet it's difficult because it's a legacy of more than 2 millennia. The social stigma does not allow certain castes to forget their identity, and this is the reality of our country.
As a corollary to caste based politics, I guess, your book on Adi Shankaracharya and the principles of Advaitha contains descriptions of a healthy amount of agnosticism.
You see, Adi Shankaracharya, when he propounds the notion of Brahman being the same in you and me, and there's a famous story of his meeting a Chandal, somebody from a lower caste, and he says, I see, for me, you are the same as I. So, in a sense, it's a attack against the man-made caste discriminations which rule our life today. And yet, between theory and practice, in societies as they evolve, there is a gulf between what they will pay obeisance to in theory and what they will continue to follow in practice. And that is the truth. Somewhere we will move to a synthesis where we reconcile theory and practice. But it takes time.
I learned from your book that Advaita is essentially non dualism or monoism. While trying to get a global philosophical perspective on Advaita, I stumbled upon Unitarianism, which a small liberal sect of Christians followed, especially after the US independence. There's enough about that online and in Wikipedia, but to my surprise, I discovered that the second president of the United States, John Adams, actually studied Hinduism for about 5 years, a fact that was not included in the documentary on Amazon Prime. I have a poor photocopy of this book by Joseph Priestley. It's titled A Comparison of the Institutes of Moses with that of the Hindus and Other Ancient Nations. It has John Adams' scribbles all over the margins. Fascinating stuff. You must have come across similar things.
In the course of writing this particular book, and each book requires its own research, I see parallels with other religions. And essentially, please understand the conquering cerebralism of Advaita is based on one basic premise that there must be something that is unified in this superficial but bewildering plurality of the cosmos. Something which is in you and which is me and which is above and far more and permanently enduring above the ephemeral world. That is the search. And in moments of deep meditation, our earlier sages, and particularly with the Upanishads, they glimpsed that there is one unifying principle pervading the cosmos.
Khushwant Singh, in his book Gods and Godmen, even though he was a committed agnostic, his views didn't differ vastly from everything that you've just said.
Khushwant Singh was a personal friend. I read, I read most of his books, and incidentally, I owe my writing career in some part to Khushwant Singh because my first book, Ghalib the Man the Times, was finding it difficult. It was difficult for me to get a publisher. I'm now talking of 1988. And Khushwant Singh was always extremely benevolent to upcoming authors, provided he saw some merit in the process. And he read the manuscript. And he had become the consulting editor of Penguin Books, which was just opening shop in India. And he told me, I'm going to ask Penguin to publish this book. To quote him, he said, "You've written a first class book." And actually, Penguin published it, which seemed like a dream come true. So, Khushwant Singh was someone I knew well, had great respect for, because beyond what he tried to project to the world, here was an extremely sound mind and a great intellect. And the two volumes that he wrote on the history of the Sikhs stands forever testimony to that.
Khushwant Singh will always stand the test of time. I look forward to reading your latest book and the ones that you will write. All power to your political career. And Pavan, thank you so much for being my guest on the Literary City today. It was a most rewarding conversation.
Thank you so much, Ramji. It was a pleasure talking.
That was author and political leader Pavan K. Varma, and I'll be back with What's That Word? And now for something completely different, our fun segment, What's That Word?, where we look at words and phrases that we use all the time but never stop to think about. And to help me with it is my co-host. As always, I'll let her introduce herself. Take it away.
Hello, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello, P with an A and not another E. Did you listen to the interview?
Yes, I did. What makes it interesting to me is that I found the Pavan Varma interview full of things I did not know or partially knew.
What specifically?
Well, you covered prose, poetry, politics, economics, Adi, Shankaracharya, and Advaitha in less than 30 minutes.
That wasn't me. That was all Pavan Varma. Me, I'm like a slick ski jet. I skim the surface at sea, quite literally.
I see you're also fishing at sea.
You know what they say, teach a man to fish with a P and he will be rich forever.
All right, I want to talk words.
Okay, P with an A, what's that word?
In your interview with Pavan Varma, you asked if the present day electoral process was new wine in an old bottle.
Yeah, you caught that.
But isn't the phrase old wine in a new bottle?
Good call. It could be both. Do you know what either of those two phrases means?
Yeah, I know the old wine in a new bottle one. It's sort of to present an old or existing concept as if it were a new one.
And new wine in an old bottle is the corollary. It simply means trying to take something that is new and pass it off as something that is well and truly established.
Right. So, old wine in a new bottle is an old concept masquerading as a new concept.
Correct.
And new wine in an old bottle is trying to force a change into something that's already established.
Very simply, a new thing being passed off as an old thing. Correct.
Right. And the relevance of how you used it in the interview?
Well, by attempting to replace the old elite with a new class of people, new wine, but without changing any of the structures that we have in place, old bottle, we are pouring new wine into old bottles. And personally, I don't have too much optimism that things are going to change all that much. We are not moving towards a more socially inclusive environment, nor are we moving towards a more economically equitable environment either. So, no matter how much punditry we throw at this, it's still pouring new wine into old bottles. But hey, that's another day, another debate.
I hear you. So, where did this come from? And also, which is the chicken and which is the egg?
Which chicken or egg? Which phrase came first? Okay, the etymology now. The phrase is from the Bible, the King James's version, and it reads, "Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved." And I think that the original reference was wine skins rather than bottles.
And why not put new wine in old bottles? What would happen?
That's elementary physics and chemistry, actually. The old wine skins would already be stretched to breaking because of exposure to the elements, sunlight, and everything, and they would be quite brittle. And if you poured new wine in there, the ensuing fermentation that happens would cause that old wineskins to burst open and the wine runneth out.
Amazing. Is there anything that happens today that our ancients had not already talked about?
Beyonce.
Okay, I'll leave you to your dreams of Destiny's Child, and I will train now to accept the venality of the night.
Oh, cool. That was a quote from Pavan Varma's poem, the one that he read in the beginning. Venality of the night, such a lovely phrase.
Totally lovely line.
Hey, do you know the synonym for that time of day? Don't say Campari time.
Twilight?
Well, twilight is good, but more poetic is crepuscule.
Like that Thelonious Monk song, Crepuscule with Nelly.
Yes, indeed, that's the one. Okay, P with an A, run along and be monk-like in your venality. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening and see you again next Wednesday.